I'm Jim Collison, and live from our virtual studios around the world, or at least here in the state of Nebraska. This is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on October 30th, 2020. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, love to have you in our chat room. There's actually a link right above me that'll take you over to YouTube, and our chat room is available there. Log in with your Google account, ask us questions live. We'll be taking those. You can also check in where you're listening from while you're at it. If you have questions after the fact, and many of you send us these emails now, which is great, send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. We'll get that routed to the right person. If you want to listen to us as a podcast on any podcast player, just search Gallup Webcasts. That'll get you actually all of them that we listen to, that we provide for you. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button and subscribe. We appreciate that as well. Dr. Jim Harter is our guest today. He is a chief scientist for Gallup's workplace management and well-being practices. He's also the co-author of the #1 Wall Street Journal and Washington Post bestseller, It's the Manager. Jim, we've talked a lot about this book over the last year or two, and congratulations on that. That was released in 2019. His work has appeared in the Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, Time Magazine, in addition to many academic publications. And I like to say he's just an all-around Gallup rock star. Jim, welcome to Call to Coach.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me on again. Good to be with everybody.
Good to have you back. I think the coaches, this is always a special treat when we get you. You're a busy guy. Not only the author of It's the Manager, you spent some time on the WellBeing Book, which Jim has picked up some, during this pandemic time. I think there's a lot of folks thinking about well-being. It's Wellbeing Week at Gallup. I didn't plan it that way. It just we'd had this plan for a month or two, and they decided to do Wellbeing Week. Jim, let's kick this off by saying why well-being and why now? What's the importance of this? A lot of folks are tuning in to hear that. Just an overarching view. Give me a couple sentences on why it's important right now, and what are we thinking?
Well, anytime that we've been tracking well-being for a long time, I think as many people know, but anytime we see changes in well-being, it tends to be due to compounding factors in our lives. And, human beings are very resilient to one thing going wrong, but we've had so many things coming at us that we've seen some historic drops in the percentage of thriving Americans, for example. We'll be updating our world poll numbers toward the end of the year, but in the U.S., we saw some of the most rapid drops in percent thriving and some of the biggest spikes in percentage of people who say they have daily worry and stress. And so I think we've all heard a lot about the mental health risks right now. We've seen some increase in the percentage of people diagnosed with depression, but also if I reference some of the Census Bureau data, they reported on some pretty big spikes in symptoms of anxiety and depression. So I think the times are very serious for everybody, and I think we've got to figure out ways that we can activate to increase the energy we have every day, and to do the right kinds of things purposefully to improve our own well-being, since we can't control everything right now.
I think you mentioned in an internal webcast that we did yesterday at Gallup that the numbers are moving faster than you've ever seen a move before. Is that true, that we're seeing some big movement?
Yeah, particularly on those things I just referenced, the percent of thriving Americans, a full 10 points when it dropped initially. It's come back some, but not all the way. And the movement on the percentage of worry and stress was pretty rapid as well. We also saw some big ticks up in the percentage of people with anger and sadness just following the George Floyd events and all the surrounding societal unrest. And so we have seen data get old faster than I've ever seen it get old. We've even seen changes in the percentage of engaged workers, which has always been kind of a rock in terms of its stability. It's back to the level it was pre-pandemic at about 36% in the U.S. engaged, but we saw it fluctuate quite a bit over the summer. And so we're keeping an eye on that and updating that regularly as well.
So much new data. We're going to write a new book about this coming out later in the spring of 2021, a March time frame. The book called WellBeing at Work, how to build resilient and thriving teams. Jim, can you talk a little bit about just kind of the book? How is it intended? And maybe how is it different than our 2010 WellBeing book that we published, 10 years ago?
Yeah, so in our 2010 book, our focus was mainly on providing information to individuals and how they can improve their own well-being. This one, the main focus is on organizational culture and how do we build a thriving culture. We're calling it a net thriving culture. Part of that starts with getting some standardized metrics, a metric in place. It's a two-part question. Many of you have probably heard of the ladder of life, where you can rate your life 0 worst possible life to 10 best possible life in the present, and then in the next 5 years, the same scale. And that combined gives us an index of net thriving. But the same 5 well-being elements, they're timeless, but how an organization can approach those 5. You might think of it as a build from amidst the manager to go to the next level in terms of impacting a workplace culture and impact, as the subtitle says, thriving and resilient teams. So we've included a lot of not only Gallup data, but also big review of the literature. A lot of meta-analyses are referenced to give people an idea about what can you really count on. If you work on something, what can you count on to get some results? So really based in large-scale studies of studies that have very stable kinds of outcomes with them, and trying to apply it to the present times and the issues we're facing, the mental health potential issues that we're dealing with now, and then also, how do we help managers get to the next level, build enough trust through some of those foundational engagement elements to take people to the next level and open the door for improving their overall lives.
Jim, if you could go back and change anything about the 2010 book, the WellBeing book, I think you mentioned kind of focused on individuals. Would you change anything? Is it still applicable today as it was 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's still applicable for individuals. We've included a lot of information, but geared more toward how a manager or leader or organizations can apply it directly.
So you
could still take the 2010 book and use it.
Yeah, so it's still applicable today. So kind of a good 1, 2, 3 punch as we think of coaches working with individuals, working with managers. That WellBeing book for everyone they coach. It's the manager to kind of work. We've realized the managers are very, very important to both engagement and now well-being. And so it's the manager would fit right in there. And then the new book, the new WellBeing book that's coming out as we think about what's coming out in March, great opportunity there. So Jim, I like that. I like that progression of well-being. It's the manager and then into the organizational spot in well-being. Would you add anything to that?
You might just think of it as an extension of the journey from boss to coach. It's taken that journey to the next level.
Yeah, and I think when we think of that idea of moving someone from boss to coach in the coaching in organizations, and then the ability to not just work on production pieces or not just work on outcomes in the workplace, but all those pieces. Today, we're going to focus a little bit on social and community well-being. We've spent some time already talking about financial and physical well-being here in this Resiliency series. But Jim, a great opportunity, right, for managers to also focus, because we know, boy, the pandemic sure has proved this out, right? When our well-being gets off, it really begins to affect our productivity as well. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, it's additive to engagement. Well, we know that engagement links to well-being. We've got plenty of data. We've just updated our meta-analysis and included well-being in our updated study of 112,000 business units. And the finding was that business units or work units that are in the top quartile in comparison to those in the bottom quartile on engagement had rates that were 66% higher on thriving overall. And so those thriving people those are people who rate their current life 7 or above on that 10-point scale, and their future life an 8 or above. One of the I think natural states as a human is to think the future will be better than the present. And one kind of positive to take away from everything that's been happening to us right now is we haven't seen drops in the percent of people who think the future will be positive in the next 5 years. It's more of a present kind of situation that people are dealing with.
Jim, how do we measure that idea of hope? How does that work? Like, how do we know for sure people aren't thinking that way just yet?
Well, the second part of that question, that latter question, asks people about the next 5 years, and so we can see whether that's changing or not. And we haven't seen declines. If we started seeing declines in that, I think that it'd be a big problem for us. So knowing both present and future and how people think about both is really important.
Yeah, it's, for me, that was eye-opening when I realized that question of how 5 years from now, it really ties back to how people are feeling about the future and are feeling about hope. And of course, we're tracking that as well. So it's great to have that available to us. If I were to do this series over again, I would have kicked it off with you because we got that kind of general overview of well-being and how it works and how it's important in to the individual and to managers and to organizations. We spent some time with Ryan Wolf talking about physical well-being, again, based on the individual. We spent some time with Ronnie and Maria talking about financial well-being, again, focused kind of the individual has that. We get to social well-being, and all of a sudden now it depends on other people because, right, the elements of this is, hey, what's going on around me and how am I doing? You know, we all came, not we all, many of us came home or our social situations changed. And this is now dependent on another individual. Jim, what have we seen in this area of social well-being? And when we think about what leads to a thriving organizations and thriving people, what have we seen in this area of social? And I'm going to ask you a little bit about what can we do on this, but what have we seen so far?
Well, we've known for some time that in a remote environment, the social component is the most at risk. And so as organizations and managers, leaders, we have to be very, very intentional about how we manage that. And now it's not only a remote environment, but people have a lot of other things they're dealing with as well. So we've during the pandemic, about 1 in 4 people reported that they had a lot of loneliness during the day, during any given day. So that's a pretty big chunk of people. And that tends to double when people say that they don't have friends and family that give them positive energy. So I think that's one outcome to be thinking about, is how do we leverage our relationships to have positive energy, and also to know that the social component is one that integrates really highly with a lot of the other elements. It's it's one we can leverage to impact other well-being outcomes that we're trying to achieve, because we tend to respond to other people. That's how we're made. And some of us will, I think also your strengths coach know this inherently, is that different people with different strengths are going to respond differently to being in a more of a remote environment. And I shouldn't suggest that all people are in a remote environment either. There are a lot of people that are out there working in that aren't working remotely, but are working on site as well right now.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about them really quick, because it's easy. The at home, everybody who came home and is kind of working out of their home office, I think has taken the majority of the media, but we have lots of people still out every day, my kids included, who have to face the public every day. What has that meant? How has this changed, or how are we seeing the scales change, or people respond who are still out working in the public? And yet that's got us, we got masks on, we got new 6-foot rules or 1 meter or 2 meter rules. How have we seen any changes in that?
Well, just to kind of look at it from the other angle, the percent of people pre-pandemic who worked from home close to full-time or close to full-time was about 4 or 5%. That jumped up suddenly to a peak of about 70 in March and April. And so it's now dropped down because we have more people going on site now. We have fewer people that are working full-time remote. It's a little under half, but it's still a big chunk. And that means there's also a big chunk of people. And depending on who you talk to, which economist you talk to, it's probably somewhere between 2/3 and half of all jobs can't be done remote. So the necessity is there for people to be on site. The advantage is they can see people, they can get some face-to-face, and we know that the face-to-face social time matters. Fortunately, when this pandemic first hit, my first reaction was, well, thank God we have Zoom and some of these other kinds of things. But we all know, and depending on your strengths individually, the Zoom may or may not work well for you. I know a number of people with high woo who said it just isn't enough. It works pretty well for me, but I think it really depends on the individual. So I think the more that this is where I think strengths, particularly now, fits into well-being so nicely, and I think it does anyway, and is probably our best opportunity for culture changes through strengths. and directing strengths at each of those well-being elements. And so how people respond to being on site or not, or in a remote environment, I think is going to depend on them individually and how they're made up.
Jim, just because they're going to ask, can you tell me your top 5?
Yeah, it's achiever, focus, relator, futuristic, and learner.
You and I yesterday in the pre-call had a conversation about that focus relator for you, and so how this has kind of played into favor for you. I admitted that I thought, and I had a lot of folks calling me very high woo, right? For me, early on in the pandemic, I had people calling me like, "Are you okay? You're going to be okay through this." And what I discovered, I have Relator, down at 8. And what I found is I just kind of I began to lean more into that. And I'd been doing webcasting for a long time, so this medium was not new to me. Is that what you mean when we think about strengths-based leaning into this? Is kind of looking at our whole selves and begin to say, okay, things are different. How am I going to lean into this differently to make a difference in what I'm doing? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think there's that focus for me. I have to manage it, because I can get so absorbed in what I'm doing that I don't take care of some of the well-being elements I need to, like making sure that I get outside, making sure that I just attend everything that I need to, and so, but the relator part makes it comfortable for me that I can still have really good relationships with people, having periodic Zoom meetings, and then going off and getting absorbed in what I'm working on. But yeah, I think it's never easy, but I think you can get some cues from your strengths that tell you what you need to watch out for and what you need to kind of lean into as well.
From a social well-being perspective, we used to talk about things like going out for a happy hour, social events, whether it's a church or a synagogue or some type of social group that may be out there. These things that gather us together, those have all been disrupted in many ways. We can't, even when we're together, social distancing is kicked in, so that's made that harder. When we're thinking about eating together or out, Don always believed when you meet, you'd eat. And so that what eating together has gotten more difficult. That has put stress on that, Jim, just from, and maybe I want to talk to the Jim Harter, the person, and maybe not Dr. Jim Harter, the scientist at Gallup. But when you're thinking and what as we have to change here, what are some things, or have we seen any strategies to help in this area of social well-being under the new rules?
Well, I think, one thing to always remember is that you can't take the social part out of the individual when they go to work. And many people have seen that with their best friend, and what we've learned there. But I think we have to create the right conditions where people can be informal. I think you've mentioned some happy hour kinds of things. I've done some of those as well. But times with coworkers where not even talking about work,
right? Just
to be able to talk about what's going on. And this does give us an opportunity to get to know each other a little differently than we did before too. So that's been good. But I think just to recognize that, what happens socially doesn't only benefit us, it benefits everybody else. And different people that we work with or that we know have different needs than us. And so I think just to be aware of that too, and to know that most of what happens and what changes in our lives has some kind of social contagion effect, or a lot of it does. And so we can not only influence ourselves by having the right kinds of purposeful social connections, but also that will impact other people and the people that they know as well.
Yeah. I mentioned to you this virtual happy hour idea that we instituted week 1 as we went home. A couple guys that I know, I said, hey, can we still get together via a Zoom, enjoy a beverage together, almost just pretend like we were together, except we're doing it virtually. And at first that was a little hokey. It just didn't feel right. But the more we did it, and I've done it every Friday and Saturday since the pandemic started, you kind of slip in and you kind of forget. You also kind of come up with some new ways of doing it where you're like, okay, this is where it is today. One of them happens to be halfway across the country for me. So it's actually have developed a relationship I didn't have before that I never would have had if the pandemic hadn't come. And so it was a great opportunity to do that. I've asked the chat room for some ideas. Go ahead, Jim.
I've seen that too, Jim. That you get to know different people you hadn't worked with before in a different kind of way. But the one thing that I think that for everybody to keep in mind with the social component is the total amount of time does matter. In most forms of social time count, even technological form. We did a big study and asked people how they spent their time and what they're doing and how that related to their mood during the day. And the technology forms matter, just like the in-person matter. The in-person matters a little bit more, but the total amount of time in person that reaches a threshold. So it isn't like the total amount of time in person has to be, they have to just go nuts over that, because we have to be healthy, right? So if there's a way to manage some in-person time and still be healthy, do it in a healthy way, I think that's always going to be the best for people. But the technology time does count too, but the technology time can reach a threshold as well where it's too much.
One of my good friends at Gallup works in the credit union, and they have we go into the credit union now, we have a shield up, which is great. But I've actually found it really helpful when I'm in the office to stop in and spend some time talking across the shield. Again, we're together. We're not, we're obeying the rules, so to speak. The shield's gone away for me. Like again, weird at first, but we've done it so many times. I think the reps are important. You said time's important. I think the reps are important too. Yeah. That we're doing it on some kind of regular basis, not letting those shields get in the way. Heather says we've hosted coffee break online under 30 minutes early in the day. It's great to connect and have no other agenda, Jim, which I think is what you're referring to, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah. Nate says, I'm working with the team that holds office hours virtually. They're all in the same virtual environment, not muted on camera, and working on their own thing gives them a sense of being together. And then I think Lisa says something important. It's important not to have waiting rooms in Zoom where the host meters a rival. In other words, you wouldn't do that in person where someone would be like, okay, you can enter the room now, right? That doesn't feel natural. I think a Zoom call where it's just open and people can kind of come and go. And so it feels like a natural, we'd have that around the water cooler, so to speak, right at work, where we might have groups that meet informally from time to time and talk out in the hallway and then they separate. It's not like someone is metering that conversation, right? Jim, any other thoughts when we think social that you could help coaches with?
Well, think about just as kind of a goal, and it's going to vary by person, but when we see mood maximized, this might seem like a big number, 6 hours of social time a day. And that can be in any form. But that's where we see mood reach its peak overall. The other point I'd make is that think of it like social time builds resources and resiliency. So as human beings, we need it to be resilient, to have energy. But it also builds resources in terms of what we can get done and how efficient we can be, and so we're not just in it by ourselves. One of the elements that we saw predicted performance even during past recessions, and we go into the past and try to pull some of the things out of there. One was whether people could see how their work connected to a bigger purpose or mission. And when people can see the bigger picture of what they're doing and how it impacts other people and how they're in it together with other people, that's a big factor in resiliency. So that's another one to consider. And that's not separate from the social component.
Yeah, you alluded to this a second ago. Julia kind of says it. She says she saw a middle school principal who hosted fun, theme-based happy hours during the quarantine. He was fun and engaging and brought about a lot of laughter. And I think in the social area, Jim, I think this is maybe an area we don't talk a lot about, but humor and laughing. Like when we're together, I don't know about a lot of organizations, but at Gallup, we laugh a lot when we're together. We're goofing around and having a good time with each other. How do you think this current situation, because we're doing it virtually, do you think it's changed that? And it's important to continue to find ways to laugh with people?
I think every meeting should have laughter. So I just think it's important. I thought that when we were in the office, and when I get on our team calls now, I might get on a little bit late because I'm coming from something else, and I just hear a bunch of people laughing. Yeah. So that's kind of what you want. No, and it builds just it kind of stretches beyond that meeting. Because you've got people you trust more. If you can laugh with somebody, you're going to build up some trust and that you're a part of a team, really, and that's what's important.
I started watching Jim Gaffigan stand up. During the pandemic, he's released a new video every day, different ways of kind of putting his stuff together. And I've just laughed. And I was amazed at how much better that just made me feel of that social element. We have a group in Chicago, a meetup group of coaches who are watching us together. So they're watching you and I do this together. So they're on Zoom watching this through Zoom and interacting. There are also different ways, I think, to get groups together and different things to do. We're seeing like Netflix and Amazon Prime have these watch together things. We can do that at work too, right? We could get together for a common purpose, watch something together, and then actually after the call, I'm going to join that group in Chicago and we're going to do a little after action kind of discussion with them. Will that work as well?
Oh yeah. In fact, we've done some of that as well. We share what we're watching on Netflix or whatever, and that generates a lot of discussion and also a lot of laughter. But yeah.
I think getting some of that real time. In other words, we're doing work in real time. We might have watched it together in a conference room before, and those conversations that go on behind the scenes, like we're watching that and having these, we would normally just chat about it, but now we got to kind of do it on Zoom or whatever. I think that creates those kinds of things, also create humor and are good for team growth. Okay, let's shift. Well, first of all, anything else you want to say in social before we shift to community?
Well, I think to just be very purposeful about how you use the technology as part of that, because and even when you need to have gaps, so you're not just zoomed out by the end of the day, or whatever medium you use, Teams or whatever. But having like back to back meetings like that, I think can start to drain. Even like some people can get kind of irritable if you have too much of that. So I think just to be very planned and purposeful and leave time for well-being breaks between meetings is really important.
Yeah, well, we just implemented that this week during our well-being week, is trying to actually schedule meetings from the top of the hour till, if it's an hour-long meeting, just 50 minutes. Give 10 additional minutes, because at Gallup, when we schedule a 60-minute meeting, we go 65, because we're that social in what we do, right? And so to be more meaningful, I think. And then one more thing I'll add from the chat room, George says working from home can be more personal. Actually, Zoom calls in your home office. I'm at home, you're at home, right? Kids, pets enter into the background. A minute before we started this call, my wife came in through the garage door, and I had to say, "Hey, I'm going live." Doesn't happen at work, right? So some of those kinds of things, business first, but personal sharing due to visual noise and distractions. And I found it during the pandemic early, the kids just wanted to be a part of every conversation, right? The kids were home for the first part of the pandemic. And I would say, put the headphones on the kids. Like I would, so they would put the headphones on, and I'd ask about their name and how old they are and what grade in school they are. And then I would say, tell me about your math homework. And they'd immediately take their headphones off, and I'd never see them again. And it was just a great way to interact with the kids. They just wanted to see what mom and dad were doing online, right? And I think we've learned some things through that as well. Jim, when we think about, let's transition to community well-being. And this is, these two are kind of related, which is why I asked you to bring it together. But what are we seeing? Kind of give us an overview of maybe what we're seeing in this area of community. First of all, what does that mean? And then what are we seeing?
Well, at a very foundational level, community well-being is living in a place that you consider to be safe. So high safety, and that you have your surroundings, your household surroundings are ideal for you is another kind of basic. And then at the highest level of community well-being is where you're actually giving back and getting recognized for giving back to the community. So and that can take on a lot of forms inside organizations. I think those first two, I think, have been disrupted the most right now because of just the health safety concerns. So that's one of the compounding factors, I think, that's led to the drops in percentage of thriving folks. So that plus a number of other things, right? Our households are a little bit different because many of us are working out of them. Many people have kids still in the household, as you mentioned, Jim, or they might be working right next to a spouse, and they're competing for airspace, so to speak. And so all that, I think, has disrupted those two components of community. So I think, in thriving in community, it's about kind of thinking about what we can activate on. And kind of have some self-control about during all this to maximize what we can. And part of that is giving, to find some ways to give that are meaningful to each person. The parts of our brain that light up when we get something light up even more when we give something. So there's that reinforcing mechanism. I think the more on any well-being element, the more we can think about what gives us energy right now that aligns with a longer-term goal is a good practice.
Some examples, Jim, just as we think about what we've seen best practices maybe happening, or if you've heard, I know we've got some great examples from Gallup, but anything you'd see as we think about best practices?
Well, not everybody can get out in the community now the way that they used to. So I think that's one of the challenges. So I think it's think about what we can do and what we can do from a virtual setting or even in our own neighborhood to impact well-being of others around us.
That's kind of the big change that I've seen, at least in my coworkers and the folks that are coaches that I talk to. They've reconnected with their neighborhood, like the neighborhood apps have been helpful. My co-host on Home Gadget Geeks said they're doing a neighborhood Halloween party where they're actually the cul-de-sac is getting out there to do that together. So maybe, we always used to complain that I didn't even know my neighbors, and now neighbors have become more important than ever. Jim, is this an opportunity for us to kind of rediscover our neighborhoods in some regard, or encourage those that we work with to rediscover their neighborhoods?
I think so. I think, because we need to get outside, and, as long as we both live in a state that's getting a little bit colder now. Yeah. But if you live in a cold state, to figure out when, there's a lot more nice days in the fall and winter than people realize, even in the cold states. And just to get outside as much as you possibly can and utilize your neighborhood or any outdoor space that you have to get some natural sunlight and to get involved. If a neighborhood cleanup, or there's all kinds of ways to get involved if you just look around, I think. I started during the pandemic. I started walking my neighborhood, and I saw houses literally change, bought and sold. One was completely flipped during the summer, and I would have never actually known or seen that if I hadn't got outside to just kind of walk. The other thing we've seen is because I've been walking, my neighbors have been walking too. And some opportunities to get out. When do we also measure? So safety and security is a big part of that, Jim. What if we don't feel safe and secure to even go outside and do those things? Well, I think the goal is to figure out a way to do it in a way that makes you feel safe and secure and healthy. And so that's going to be somewhat individual. We know individuals vary a lot in how worried they are about the health component going on right now with the virus. So it's about a matter of following the guidelines and keeping the social distance, of course, and doing it in a way that, trying to make it work in the context of what we're dealing with here. But we think about that we all have basic human needs, and we can't just let those needs wither away through this. There are things we can do to meet many of those needs, and one is try to get outside, get some exercise, and do it in a safe way. Same thing with the in-person we talked about earlier with social. We can still do it. We just need to do it in a safe way. And we're all of us are concerned about the elderly and the people at risk, and so we have to watch that as well. But I think if we really think about each one of those well-being elements, each one of us we can activate on some things that will improve our lives and the people around us.
I actually started taking some of my meetings outside when the weather, of course, was appropriate, right? To be able to get that sunlight, change of location, some of those things. Jim, how can organizations and managers help their teams as we think about this area of community? We just had what we call R&R, recognition and roundtable. That was today, right before this meeting. And I think it was Completely Kids. That's one of the organizations that we work with. They have kind of COVID proofed their facility so that organizations can show up and do what they used to do. We used to do that in person. Now there's some things that have to go into place to make sure that's safe. But how do you think organizations and managers can help in this area of community? What could they proactively be doing, you think?
Well, one is to really learn what community issues are most important to the people on your team, and to share those. So the first thing is just awareness on what people are passionate about, and to create some awareness about what's possible. So I think the organization's job is to help people see, not to limit it, but to help people see the breadth of things that they could impact, and to see where there's some of those natural connections. I think it's okay for people to know that they can be somewhat selfish about. So people get involved in things that might fit their lifestyle now, and that might change later. They might be passionate about maybe it's breast cancer because they had a family member who had it. But you can be very individually specific and passionate about something that's meaningful to you and the people in your life. The other thing is for employers to leverage the strengths and the personal histories of each person to start identifying some of those issues that fit them, and to align them with whatever well-being programs work. The other thing is to provide opportunities for people to share what they've done. I think, Jim, when you said our recognition roundtable, that's a great avenue for us at Gallup to share what different people are doing in the community, and that then gets other people to say, well, that seems like something I'd be interested in as well. And it also kind of reinforces the value of the organization beyond, what we're getting done with other organizations, what we're actually doing in our community overall as well. And I think that stimulates a lot of involvement from within the organization. The other thing I'd say is that in addition to recognizing the contributions that people have made, to let people know that you just need to start. If you're not doing anything now, just start small. Just do something. It could be as small as you want it to, but just start doing something. Because I think when people identify something they're passionate about, they start doing it, even if it's a little thing. It'll build over time because there's a reinforcement. Like I said, when you give, your brain lights up, and you get a reinforcement from that.
We from our Q12 work that recognition in a 7-day period is super important. Our recognition and roundtable event kind of kills two birds with one stone, so to speak. It gives us an opportunity to have community. When we first started doing that via Zoom, and we brought every single employee who wanted to be on the Zoom call with the camera and microphone on, I thought they were crazy. Just to be honest, it's like, I'm a webcast guy. I like to control. This is why all called to coaches are not Zoom calls. It's a one-way conversation. I thought they were crazy. Over the last 6 months, we as an organization have gotten better at it. Like the employees now understand kind of the rules and how to be good citizens in that setting. Make sure your mic is muted, but leave your camera on. Today, folks were dressed up. It's Halloween here this weekend here in the United States. People were dressed up in costumes, bringing in the humor element, which I thought super funny. And then, of course, we had our recognition, All-Stars, Royal Stars, MVP. All those awards were given out as well to give that recognition. That single event kind of lights up all those things, right, Jim?
It really does. Do you notice that people are also mess around with their backgrounds a lot? So they use that as a way to kind of bring some variety and humor into it. Yeah,
for sure. A couple comments from the chat room. Kevin says, I live and work in a highly agricultural centric area. The opportunity to help build CSA boxes has been great. And many of those who are going to food insecure families, very rewarding, right? The opportunity.
Great example.
Yeah. To turn that kind of community, and it does, Jim, it does feel so good. Like, I think if you're feeling depressed, go do something for somebody. It seems so counterintuitive, right? But the more opportunities we get, I think that makes us feel better, right? Gives us a kind of more positive light. How important is it that organizations, I don't think people by themselves do it. How important is it that organizations lead the way on this? And by the way, organizations are made up of managers, right? Ultimately, it comes down to managers. How important is that?
I think it's essential. I think most culture change that we see starts at the top. It has to be owned at the top, and then it gets cascaded through the managers in the organization and gets deployed at a local level where, when we're talking about community involvement, it can come from different channels than the manager, but the manager can have a big role in communicating what the rest of the team is doing and pull team members together with common interests. And so, it starts with the organization and setting the tone about this is what we're about, and we're not going to waver on that. We're about something bigger than just the money that we're making. we're about something bigger than just the work that we do every day. That we have a chance to impact. Again, it's that mission or purpose component, but we have a chance to impact something bigger than just our own organization.
Yeah. I just had a cat show up here in the corner of the screen. I have never had that happen before, but a great opportunity. Jennifer mentions she started a Facebook group called Shop Local for local artists, small businesses to share their products. Great opportunity to bring. It doesn't necessarily need to be workplace related, right? It could be community related. And I think, Jim, what it says sometimes is when we feel things are completely out of our control, we do have control over these things, especially at the local level. Like, I think hopefully we don't miss this. We're going to create a bunch of these local community groups. Hopefully when this is all over, we don't miss that point. I think we'd kind of gotten away from that before. Everybody was so busy going to soccer practice and sports and events. And now we're really spending time together instead of just driving all over the place. I think it's a great opportunity for us to keep that. Jim, would you add anything as we think about community, anything we missed, or what else would you add?
Well, no, I agree with that last point a lot. I mean, that's very important. You know, one of the things I've been thinking about as we've been studying the data during this time period is to contrast, again, speaking about what we can control, right? To contrast how burnout is made up. And we have seen increases in burnout, particularly for the people who are, so pre-COVID, the people who are working from home close to 100% had lower burnout than others. But now, during COVID, the people working from home almost all the time have spiked up in burnout, have higher levels of burnout. So there's that risk. But if we kind of break down what burnout is and contrast that with a positive state, which Mihai Csikszentmihalyi would call flow, which is what all of us are really in the end striving for every day, to have a flow experience where we're absorbed in what we're doing and have a lot of positive energy. Burnout and flow both have high challenge. The burnout stage has some compounding factors that bring you down, that make that challenge of that experience not fun at all. It wears you down. A flow state has high interest and high energy. So the more we can think about, not just with community, but with all 5 of the elements, what we're going through right now, and to keep track of what does give us high energy, and that aligns with, you know, the longer term goals we're trying to reach, even though many of us don't know what the long term holds. We can be fairly confident that it's going to turn out okay, I think, down the road, but we can have some control over those kinds of things. I guess one thing.
Yeah. Jim, you mentioned that to me yesterday. I've been thinking a lot about that, just that flow versus burnout and how close they are together. And I have found during this time, I thought overnight, I was thinking kind of through the questions I wanted to ask you today and such. And that just kind of kept coming back to mind. And for me, the difference has been when I find myself diving a little bit, I think, what can I do that I can do well, that will give me really high positive energy? Whether it's a project here at the house of putting something in or fixing something or walking out in the yard. I've had a little bit of a mole problem, you know, out in my yard. I love my yard. And so I've been working on that project, right? And it's given me something to kind of own and look forward to and get excited about them. That's probably a bad example, but I've done a bunch of home projects. Is that what we're talking about? In other words, because we can go down one or two paths. We can go down the burnout route, or we can go out the thriving, go out focus in that area. Is it just a matter of making a decision at some point in time and saying, I'm going to choose to do something different that brings energy, that brings focus, that brings that to me, flow to me? Is it as easy as that? It can't be. I'm sure there's more to it than that. Well,
we're living in obviously very tough times with a lot of things coming at us that we're having to adapt to. Yeah. But I guess the point is that if we can just be very conscientious. I was on a session earlier in the week, and one of the gentlemen on it was an expert in mindfulness. And so he was talking about that. So I guess I'd take from that, how can we be mindful about what we're going through each day and what's given us positive energy, instead of our natural state is to kind of go through each day and we don't necessarily remember everything that happens during the day. And then we get to the end of the week and we said, oh, what the heck happened that was a long week, or
Yeah.
it wore on me. But to actually be mindful of what we're experiencing and what's giving us high interest, those two things, high interest and high energy, so that we can be intentional about how we do that in this, particularly as, these cold states where we're going to be inside probably more than we were before. And we lose another element of control, right?
Yeah.
But then Ryan Wolf said the other day that there is no such thing as cold weather. There's just the wrong weather. There's just the wrong clothes. So I guess we can get out in the cold too.
When you start working out outside, you get warm pretty fast.
Yeah.
Lisa, I think in the chat room was talking, and I can't find it right now at this point, but I want to summarize it. This Called to Coach community has grown together during the pandemic as well, and is maybe a part of some people's community well-being. This is an opportunity to listen to an event, have a conversation, get to know some people. And during this time, our live numbers doubled at the very beginning of the pandemic. So we used to do 30, we now do 60. Yeah, I'm looking at 58 right now. So we're at 60 on it. We doubled, and it has stayed there, which is great. This is a form of community well-being, right? Just getting together. I mentioned that group in Chicago, forming new groups around a common purpose with positive energy. I'm hoping this is positive energy. This works for community well-being, right?
You bet. Yeah. Like very simple. And you mentioned the overlap between social and community. There is some, and that's one of the areas where, the social time and the sheer amount of social time in any form helps.
Yeah. So good. Jim, anything else we'd add before we kind of wrap it up?
I think that's probably about it on community well-being.
We have career well-being. That's the final one to finish. So we've done 4 now. Faith Gaines is coming to join us here and I should know the date of that, but I don't right off the top of my head. It's coming up here in a couple of weeks. If you want to join us for that, go to gallup.eventbrite, BRITE, gallup.eventbrite.com, and you can get registered for that just like this. And we'll spend some time. Jim, anything, since you won't be there, and we discussed the other, as we think about career well-being going forward, anything you just kind of highlight ahead of Faith that you'd say the importance of that, because it's never been had a bigger impact than it is right now.
Yeah, it's just essential as a foundation for everything else that we study in well-being. It's the most important element because it touches so many different parts of our life, from the sheer amount of time we spend in our careers to the financial aspects of it impact us, the relationships. I mean, it really crosses over into all the different domains. If you have high career well-being, you have a better chance of contributing to the community. One other thing I'd point out to the group is just that thank you for the work you're doing with strengths, because I really think that strengths is the best conduit to improving well-being. We need to understand, we've been studying this quite a bit, and we'll include this in our upcoming book, is how each individual strength can be leveraged to impact each of the 5 well-being elements. So the more we can work through the person, think of it as a path of efficiency through that person and many of you are probably doing this right now with people you're working with, but the more that we can leverage the individual strengths to achieve well-being, and not a lot of programs out there assume that people are kind of the same, and expect everybody to be a type A personality and achieve the same kinds of things with programs, whether it's a dietary program or a workout. People don't have to be athletes to have high physical well-being. They need to channel what's innate and direct it at those 5. And I think the work that you all are doing is going to be going to lead organizations to creating what we call a net thriving culture overall.
Net thriving culture. I like that terminology. I'm pretty excited about it. Just a reminder in that book, Well-Being at Work, How to Build Resilient and Thriving Teams, out in March. So that's at least the scheduled date at this point. So hopefully, hey, it's a crazy world right now, but we're shooting for March to have that out. Great opportunity. Of course, we're going to make a big deal about it here on Called to Coach. So if you just stay close to the community, you won't miss a beat on that. If you somebody asked a question in the chat room about Chicago group, of any of the groups, if you haven't joined us in our social communities, that's kind of the best way to stay up to date on everything that's going on. And I should say, I'm super proud of the communities, by the way, Jim. Everything you've said they have done very, very well. In other words, they've organized kind of based on their strengths. So those folks who are good at doing public events and doing training and doing learning, they've gotten out there and made those groups available. For the folks who are good at doing the thinking and the conversations, they're doing that as well. And they're doing it in a way they're gathering more often together on a regular basis. And then I just think about what the chat room means here. So it's happening. It's different than it ever was before. It's a big boom to the social communities that we have here. But Jim, thanks for taking the time to do that as well. You mentioned the numbers. When we think about our data in our research and all these things that you just talked about, what's really the best way for folks to stay up to date with everything we're publishing and everything you're publishing around this data that and these insights we're discovering? What's the best way to do that?
We get them out pretty quickly in our Gallup.com articles. So if you stay tuned into Gallup.com and check out our workplace section for that, and we publish both from our workplace findings and then also from the more general societal issues. You'll get all the latest stuff. We've been turning out articles pretty quickly throughout the pandemic and have been tracking the well-being of folks regularly.
Good. Sorry, keep going.
Nope, I'm done.
Sorry to interrupt you on that one. We do have a CliftonStrengths Insight newsletter too, and we highlight what you're doing in that as well. And so if you want to sign up for that, head out to gallup.com/CliftonStrengths. At the very bottom of the page is the newsletter sign up. So you can click up. We have a couple Insight newsletters. You can sign up for those and kind of stay up to date on all those things. Jim, I mentioned our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/call-to-coach is a great place to go if you want to do that on, maybe you're not a Facebooker, you want to do it on LinkedIn. Head over to LinkedIn and search CliftonStrengths Trained Coaches. And we have a group over there. The engagement's a little bit different in that group, but it's still a group on LinkedIn if you're not on Facebook and want to do that as well. I mentioned if you want to follow us for all the webcasts that are coming up, maybe this is the first time or that you've listened to it, head over to gallup.eventbrite.com. And if you have any questions about anything, and many of you are doing this, I'm getting about 8 of these a day these days, which is great. You can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Jim, Dr. Jim Harter, Chief Scientist, super smart guy. And listen, we're super lucky to have you here at Gallup. Thanks for coming on today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's a pleasure.
And for those joining live, thanks for joining us today. We will not do any post-show today. So thanks for coming out. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.